Hello there and welcome to my talk. My name is Nader Dabit. I'm excited to be here talking about something I'm extremely passionate about. I am a developer relations engineer at a Web3/blockchain/crypto company called Edge and Node. And I want to go ahead and jump right in because I have a lot to talk about. And I'm going to be talking about and showing you how to build dApps with React. Now, a dapp is a short acronym for decentralized app. And a decentralized app is kind of the essence of building on Web3. So before we kind of talk about how to build a dapp, let's talk about what Web3 is, and I can give you my opinion about it, what it is, and why I'm excited about it. Well, Web3 is essentially the decentralized web. So when you hear people talking about Web3, they're kind of talking about how they might build applications that encompass a lot of the different things that are, the ethos of what the decentralized web movement is kind of like aiming towards, and some of the things that we're starting to see happen now. So when we say Web3, the reason that that name is around is because a lot of times people partition the internet into three separate kind of buckets of time that we've experienced. And mainly because of the types of functionality that were there really changed the way that we interacted with applications. Web 1.0 was often referred to as the read-only web. This is where most people could not actually create things. Only developers were creating sites. Everyone else was essentially just consuming them. So you could read stuff, you could look at news, you could learn things, but you could not create anything unless you were kind of an engineer or developer. Web 2.0 changed all of that. We now have, this is kind of where we're living today. We have all types of ways to create things without being a developer. Creating things through TikTok, through Instagram, through YouTube, through blogs and wikis. Even WordPress could be considered kind of a really great example of what Web 2 is. And Web 2 is great, but there are a lot of things that we think we can improve upon, and therefore, people are starting to categorize a lot of the new stuff that's happening into Web3. And why is this stuff happening? Well, let's talk about the fundamental changes around why these things are happening today. Now, when we talk about building websites, we're often, as developers, using things that have been around for a while. These web protocols that we're just kind of used to at this point. So you've probably used, as a developer, things like SSH, TCP, FTP, HTTP. Now, the internet has really thrived because of these native internet protocols. One of the reasons that these protocols are so successful is that they basically are widely adopted. They're not subject to change. If I upload a site using HTTP, people can view it without any intermediary. We can basically trust that it's going to work. And while we did have the ability to upload text files, attach them to the addresses, make them accessible, build various types of applications, there were two major pieces of functionality that were not there and have not been there until blockchain technology came around. And those are native payments and native state. So digital payments that do not need a centralized intermediary, or native state that did not need a centralized intermediary. So when you think of a centralized intermediary for payments, you might think of something like PayPal or Stripe, where you kind of have to have a very, very complex infrastructure to make this work. And for state, you could just think of a database that's centralized and hosted somewhere, typically AWS or some cloud provider, or maybe even in your living room. So Web3 is enabled by combining all of the things that we've known before and native payments and state enabled through blockchain technologies. And Web3, essentially, adds a lot of different things. So when you hear these discussions, they're often very, very, there's a big variance in what people are doing because there's so many things that have been enabled by this stuff. But what are the characteristics of Web3? Well, you'll hear different opinions about these things, but they really all are very similar, and these are kind of the characteristics that I like to outline. First of all, decentralized. You'll hear decentralization spoken about a lot, not only in how we build the applications, but how these applications are run and who owns these applications. Ownership of data in the platform. So in Web3, a lot of the applications and the companies and the things that are being built are not centralized in the ownership of just a handful of people. They're more distributed for the most part. native digital payments through cryptocurrencies or digital tokens, self-sovereign identity, meaning that we do not hand ownership of our identity over to all these applications. Instead, we control what our identity looks like and what we decide to hand over to these platforms, and they do not store it in their own centralized servers. Distributed, trustless, and robust infrastructure. So instead of having an application running in a single node or a single server that may or may not go down, instead we deploy to a decentralized network of nodes. That way we have a much more robust infrastructure, meaning that if one server goes down, we have hundreds or thousands of others still running our infrastructure. Open and public backends is a really interesting piece to this that I'm really fascinated by, where people are basically building out different front ends to compete against each other on public backend data. So with YouTube, you create a video. YouTube owns your platform, your video, your followers, everything. Of course, there's like an API that you can probably wrangle together and make it accessible, but it isn't something that's completely open, and YouTube can anytime decide to take your videos down. With Web3, the idea is that your backend is public, it's completely open, and anyone can build upon it, not just yourself, but anyone that decides to. So therefore, again, you have apps competing on interfaces for the same data. So what is this distributed, trustless, robust infrastructure I'm talking about? So let me give you a few examples, because in the Web 2 stack, I know I need identity, I need a database, I need server for some type of business logic. I need all these different pieces. So we have these pieces in Web 3 as well, though some of the pieces are not yet mature, as mature in Web 2. So the graph protocol is what I work with. This is an API layer for querying blockchain data. We have the Ceramic network, which is an off-chain storage solution, something like a database, but it's a decentralized database. We have LivePeer, which is a decentralized live streaming service that's, again, running in a decentralized network. For file storage, we have Arweave and IPFS. For Git, we have Radical. So there's a lot of different protocols that I'm not even mentioning here, but this is just kind of an example of some of the things that are out there. And then for Web3 wallets, we have a bunch of them really at this point, but a couple of the ones that I use and I like the most are MetaMask and Rainbow. And wallets are a really important part of how you interact with applications, because they not only contain the tokens that you own for a certain address, but they also allow you to manage your identity. And we'll take a look at that in our demo. So what are the benefits and repercussions around Web3? Well, the one that I'm really most excited about is ownership. And I'm going to give a few examples of this, starting with gaming. With Fortnite is a game that my kids play a lot, and I spend, hundreds, honestly, of dollars on it for them. And they buy skins, and they buy, V-Bucks. And this V-Bucks is an in-game currency. We pay the platform, and the money goes to the platform. And from there, we don't really see anything of it. It goes to a centralized place, and from there, that company's making a lot of money. Now, this is interesting, and it's been extremely innovative. Fortnite has really changed the way that people think about gaming. But there are now Web3 games that enable ownership for the people playing them, but also something called play to earn, where the players actually make money. And in the case of Axie Infinity, which is probably the most successful Web3 game right now, people are actually quitting their jobs and playing Axie Infinity full time, especially in countries where the average income is a lot less maybe than the United States or parts of Europe or whatever. So for instance, with Axie Infinity, when the player plays the game, they do still interact with currency, but instead of 100% of the currency going to the platform takes a 4.25% cut, and 95% comes back to the user. It comes back to the user in the form of digital currency that they can sell on the open market, but also in-game purchases that they can resell in the form of something like an NFT. So when you buy a skin or you buy a character, you can actually get tired of it and decide to sell it to someone else. And therefore, people are a lot more incentivized to actually play the game and spend their time and money, because they're actually getting something out of it, as opposed to just dumping money and having it go to a centralized server. Axie Infinity is generating over $500 million a month in actual volume. They also have more than 2 million daily active users. 2 million daily active users is a lot. If you've ever built software before, you realize that this is a huge deal. And if you look at the numbers here, this is just between July and October. So the numbers of players have skyrocketed now that people kind of understand how this works, because it makes just a lot more sense for you to invest your time and money in a place that allows you to hold on to some of that value. A lot of people in the gaming community are really excited about this. So Ryan Wyatt is essentially, talking about this quite a bit lately. He is the head of YouTube Gaming. I'm bullish on NFTs. He's talking about play to earn. You also have Mark Pingus, who is the head of Zynga. Play to earn and play to win is the next evolution of freemium. This is just a small example. There's also a lot of capital investment from venture capitalists going into play to earn games. There's also this idea of like the new creator economy, where we kind of take the ideas that we had in the past and we enable more equity for the people that are participating in the social media platforms that we're kind of used to. So in Web 2, we have a lot of interesting social media platforms, but they really depend on a couple of things that are not probably ideal. One of those is the exploitation of user data. Advertising, the idea around I would say surveillance capitalism is something that you hear thrown around. Also, there's zero ownership. So when I create a profile and I gain 1 million users, I can't really take those users anywhere. No one really, I don't really benefit off of any of the posts that I post there, other than finding some way to kind of like squeeze in some advertising there. What if instead social media platforms gave you a portion of the earnings of the platform, but also allowed you to sell items within the platform? And that's where we're headed with social media and Web3. And you're already starting to see a glimpse of this with NFTs and tokenization in other parts of the Web3 world. A great example of this is a developer named Takawo, who created a project called Generative Masks that was an NFT project that took all of the money that was made from the project and gave it back to the community that he was part of. So he wanted to raise money for generative art community and also like a handful of other art communities. So he created Generative Masks, and he created an NFT collection of 10,000 items. He made over $3 million in a few minutes. He gave all of that money to his community. And also, whenever someone buys and sells one of these NFTs in the open market, it also generates revenue. So any commission off of that still goes to his community. So he has this long living revenue stream. People that want to basically invest in that community can buy one of these things and they can resell them on the open market as well. So it provides new incentives around contribution, and people that bought these feel part of a community. It's really interesting when you see things like this. And this gives you a glimpse of maybe of how someone with the following might be able to start, creating different projects, giving ownership to their community for other different types of things. Another interesting example of ownership and social media paying their users is Super Rare. Super Rare is an NFT marketplace that I think is moving towards maybe some social media aspects in the future. But anyone that interacted with this platform and used it was airdropped some Super Rare tokens when they launched their tokens. These tokens ended up being worth anywhere between a few thousand to over $100,000 US. So if you were interacting with this platform, you just got paid. I think we're going to see more and more of that. Another interesting example is the Bored Ape Yacht Club, and this is more around a combination of a community and creating some type of project that ends up being able to be used in a lot of different areas. For instance, products, merchandising. You have ways to kind of take these characters and do other stuff with them, license them out, and so on and so forth. So Bored Ape Yacht Club has already sold over $100 million in tokens, and they've created a community of people that are really excited about being part of this community. So there's Discord servers, there's events, there is creative people. There are creative people getting together and doing interesting stuff with these images. Clothing, intellectual property is a big part of this. So I think that what we're going to start seeing is creative ways to make this even more accessible by the average person. And I personally think that Web3 will have a social media platform that will probably overtake what we've seen, or at least provide a competitor to some of the stuff we're seeing today. And it will probably be either through an NFT marketplace or a digital or a Ethereum wallet or some type of Web3 wallet. And you're already seeing people focusing on this. There are actually countless examples of this. A couple of big ones, though, might be Jack, the founder of Twitter, building out Blue Sky, a decentralized Twitter alternative. And then you have the founder of Aave, which is one of the biggest DeFi marketplaces, talking about building out their own version of some type of decentralized Web3 social media platform. Interested in watching how those projects continue, as well as a few other ones that I've seen out there. Communities and DAOs are another interesting part of Web3. These kind of allow people to get in early in some type of community or what we used to think of as a company and have ownership. So for instance, with Friends with Benefits, it's a bunch of Web3 artists and creators. To get in a year ago to buy into this DAO was $20, and now people are investing into this DAO. And if you had bought in at that point and help foster this community just by being part of it, your ownership stake would now be closer to $12,000. So it kind of gives people a reason. So like a lot of times you're interacting in Discord communities for these big companies, but you're not getting paid for that. What if instead you could provide some ownership to the people that are building these communities? And that's what these DAOs are doing. So Developer DAO is a DAO that I created a little over a month ago, and we now have over 2,000 members. Everyone that's part of this DAO has a token, an NFT, but we're also working on getting a ERC20 token allocation, not only from our own DAO, but from other DAOs as well for collaborations and stuff. So it gives people ownership for creating and participating in communities. Capital and funding is big. You're starting to see a lot more VC money coming in from things like or companies like A16Z. So let's talk about building though. So what does it look like to build a dapp, and what is this project that we're about to build look like? Well, when you think of a typical Web 2 infrastructure, you have these things that kind of make them up. You have compute, you have data, you have storage for file storage, you have identity and authentication, and then you might have web hosting. Using these and combining them together, you can do a lot. So in Web3, you kind of have the same thing, but you now also have this added idea of smart contracts that allow you to deal with digital payments and native digital payments and native state. And also you try to make sure that the infrastructure that you're building on is decentralized. Now, smart contracts are by nature going to be decentralized, but maybe these other pieces are not going to be, right, if you're using kind of the old way. So, we're still getting there with this stack, but some of the things that I mentioned earlier are already working quite well. Some of these areas are more mature than others. But we're going to build kind of a really basic version of a dapp today, and this is our stack. We're going to be needing a client framework, a blockchain, a client library, and a wallet. So how do we choose a blockchain? Well, let's talk about a few of the ones that are popular out there. Ethereum is probably one of the most well-known. And a few of the other ones that I'm kind of interested in are Avalanche and Phantom and Near and Solana. These are all blockchains that enable some type of compute with smart contract development. And all of these have a pretty good ecosystem of developers that are building out some interesting stuff. But the one that we're going to be using today is Ethereum, or Ethereum Virtual Machine. The interesting thing about writing for Ethereum or the EVM is that you can learn how to write code in one way, and you can build on over a dozen different blockchains. So this is almost like the JavaScript or React of the blockchain world. You can learn Solidity in this development environment, and you can build for Avalanche. You can build for Arbitrum, you can build for Optimism, Polygon. There's so many of them that are out there. So this is what we're going to be focusing on today. Our client framework is going to be React. Our Ethereum development environment is going to be Hardhat, and our client library is going to be Ethers.js. Ethers.js you could think of as something like Fetch or Axios. But this is for Ethereum, and then our Ethereum wallet is going to be MetaMask. So what we want to do is go ahead and do a live demo and start building. So let's go ahead and jump to it. So we're starting off in an empty React repository, and all I have done so far is install a few packages like ethers.js and the hardhat dependency just by doing npm install. And from here, we're going to build out and scaffold an Ethereum project, and we're going to then test it out on our front end. So to do that, I can just run npx hardhat. And as long as you have run npm install hardhat, you should now be able to scaffold out an Ethereum environment. So I'm going to click choose basic project, the project root, and I'm going to just take all of these defaults. And now if we go ahead and open this project in our text editor, we should be able to go ahead and see that hardhat has created a few different files and folders for us. First of all, we have a hardhat configuration at hardhat.config.js. And this is where we define all of the different settings for our Ethereum environment. And what I want to do here is basically go ahead and update this module.exports. And I want to set the artifacts directory as src/artifacts, because when you import something in React, you need to import it from the source folder. And we're going to be compiling our smart contract into something called an ABI. And ABI is short for Application Binary Interface. You could think of this something like a GraphQL query definition that we're going to be using with ethers.js to call the Ethereum network. And this is going to be automatically compiled for us by hardhat. We can just tell it where to compile. And it's going to be based on a smart contract that we're going to look at in just a moment. We also want to set the hardhat chain ID, and this is for us using a local network, and by default the chain ID is set to 1337, so we just want that to match. Next, we'll go to our contracts directory, and we see that we have a really basic example smart contract that's been scaffolded out for us. This is called greeter, where we have a local variable called greeting. We have a constructor that takes in an argument that sets the greeting, and then we have two basic functions, one that returns the greeting string and the other that updates the state to set the greeting. Now, using these two functions in this constructor, we can have a really basic project that allows us to query for a message and then update that message. So that's what we're going to be doing here in this contract. So essentially a hello world of Solidity. So with that being said, what we want to do now is learn how we might compile this contract. So what I mentioned earlier, where we set those configuration path for our artifacts, we can now create that artifacts by running npx hardhat compile. This is going to go in our contracts directory, find that contract, look in our hardhat config, and compile that and place it in our src folder. So now if we go to src, we see we have artifacts, and we can now start importing this artifact to connect to the project after it's been deployed to the blockchain. Now, how do we actually deploy this to the blockchain? Well, we can actually either deploy this to a live network like Ethereum mainnet, or we can run a local test network. And it's actually really simple to run a local test network. So I'm going to go ahead and split my window, and I'm going to run npx hardhat node, and this is going to run a local Ethereum node. And here we're given the node is running, but we're also given a handful of actual accounts that we can import and use in our actual Ethereum wallet. And this is going to be useful because we can import this, and we can have 10,000 ETH in each address, which is what we're going to need to basically be able to ride a transaction. We're going to need to have some ETH. The next thing we can do is now deploy our contract to this node. So we've compiled our contract, we've created it, we can now deploy this. And once we're done deploying it, we should now be able to interact with it. So I'm going to run this here. I need to actually update the script name to deploy. And this was created for us by hardhat. npx hardhat run scripts/deploy.js, and for some reason that's not working. Let's try this one more time. There we go. Actually, I need to specify the network is localhost. All right, there we go. So when this deploys, we should see some stuff logged out here. And this is basically logging out, that this was deployed. This is the contract address. This is, transaction information and stuff like that. We also, just ran a script that we haven't really checked out. So let's go ahead and look at this deploy script. And I want to delete a lot of these comments because this is in reality not a lot of code. It's only like 4 lines of code. So what we have here is this deploy script where we're getting the contract ABI by looking in the artifacts directory and looking for the greeter contract. And that's going to be here, artifacts/contract/greeter. So we're getting a reference to that. We're then deploying this to the local network. And then once this is done being deployed, we're logging out the address. And we're going to need that address in just a moment because this is the address here. Because when you're interacting with an Ethereum network, to call some type of function on a smart contract, you typically need 2 things. You need the network address, so it would be almost like the HTTP endpoint, but in the blockchain world, it's really referred to as the RPC endpoint, and this is going to be the entry point to that network. So for us, it's going to be localhost 8545 because we're on a local development environment, but this might be an actual real live endpoint. And then we also need the address. So we need the RPC endpoint and the address to send an HTTP request to create a transaction. So now that we have that stuff, let's go ahead and jump into our front-end code and try to interact with this project. So I'm going to go ahead and open src/app.js. And I want to first go ahead and import use state from React and the ethers library from ethers. We're importing use state because we want to define some local state. And then we're getting that ABI that was created for us when we compiled and put it in the artifacts directory. We next want to go ahead and set the address for our contract. And this was logged out here. So I'll go ahead and put that here. So this is going to be how we define our smart contract deployment address. And we're going to need that in just a moment. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to define a local variable called greeting and a function called setGreetingValue. And this is going to give us a way to basically set some local state for the user as they type if they want to update the greeting from whatever we used when we deployed it. The next function is really interesting because this is how we actually interact with the user's Ethereum wallet. When someone has an Ethereum wallet like MetaMask or anything else installed in their browser, the browser has now a local window global variable injected called window.ethereum. And we can call functions, we can call methods against that variable. And this one we're calling window.ethereum.request. And we're saying request their accounts. This allows them to authenticate with Ethereum essentially. The next thing we want to do is have a function called fetch greeting. And this is going to allow us to read the greeting value from the smart contract deployment. These 2 lines of code I would say are the most interesting. First of all, we're creating something called a provider. And this is kind of getting the window.ethereum context and calling a method called ethers.providers.web3 provider. And using this provider, we can create an interface to interact with the actual smart contract here in this line of code, where we're passing in the greeter address, which is the contract deployment address. We're passing in the ABI, and then we're passing in the provider. And then from here, we can just call functions against the contract. So any function that was there, that's a read function, we can do. So here we're just calling contract.greet, and we're logging out that value. We're not doing anything with it other than logging it out. The only other function that we want to do is to interact with the contract by writing a new value of greeting. And the 2 most interesting things that are happening here are going to be the same thing where we're getting that provider, but now instead of just passing in the provider to the contract call, we're now creating something called a signer. And we need a signer when we're writing a transaction or a state update to the blockchain. And this is going to prompt the user with their Ethereum wallet to approve this transaction, as we're about to see. But this isn't a ton of code. We really are doing all of this stuff in about 5 lines of code if we kind of look at these 5 lines here. And then we're calling contract.setGreeting. So again, we're just calling the functions within the smart contract itself. And then the last thing we're going to do that's not really Web3 related, so I'm not going to dive into it too much. We're just going to create a really basic form. And this form is, is going to just return 2 buttons, one for fetching the greeting, one for setting the greeting. And then we're going to have an input value that allows the user to change the greeting. So that was a lot, but let's go ahead and test this out. I wanted to cover everything if we could. So let's go ahead and try to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and run npm start. All right, and it looks like our app has started, and here we see that we have our 2 buttons, one for fetching greeting and one for setting the greeting. Now, before we set the greeting, we actually, again, need to have some type of Ethereum in our wallet. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to go here to where we deployed, or where we kind of created our local network. We're going to copy this private key. I'm going to go back to my browser. I'm going to open MetaMask. I'm going to pull up the local host endpoint, and we're going to go ahead and we are going to import an account. Here I can paste in the private key, and here you'll see that we have 9,999.999 ETH. The reason we don't have 10,000 is because when we deployed this contract, we used the gas from this address to pay for that. So now we can go ahead and test it out. So I'm going to go ahead and click Fetch Greeting. Here we see that we have Hello Hard Hat. And now we're going to call Set Greeting by updating to Hello React London. And now we see that we are being prompted to authenticate with our wallet. Next, we can go ahead and confirm this transaction by paying for that transaction cost. And now if we refresh, we see that we are fetching the greeting, and the greeting has been updated. So that wraps up my talk. For next steps, if you're looking to learn more, I would check out Scaffold ETH, which is a project that has over 200 different branches of example reference architectures of apps that people have built using similar stacks as what we just looked at. If you're interested in Solana development, I would check out Anchor, and I would also check out my guide that I wrote for Solana, the complete guide to full stack Solana development. Diving deeper into Ethereum, if you want to go further than what we just covered today, my guide, the complete guide to full stack Ethereum development, been viewed a couple of 100,000 times at this point. A lot of people seem to like it, and that's it. So I appreciate you checking out my talk. I hope you learned something, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out on any social media channels or here at the conference.